So back when I was getting ready to go to seminary, and when I started seminary, I was really drawn to the prophets. And for clarity's sake, we're talking about the prophets P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S, not P-R-O-F-I-T-S, because if that's what you're drawn to, seminary is a bad place to go. So I was drawn to the prophets that we read about in the Hebrew Scriptures. I was drawn to them because they were the adventurous ones in Scriptures. They were the risk takers. Their lives were dangerous and exciting, and that really drew me to them. You know, we kind of have this vision of ministers as kind of dull, sort of white bread, calm kind of people, and that wasn't what I wanted to go into ministry to be. 20 years later, that's probably a different story. I'm not quite as excitable as I was back then. But back then, I wanted to go into ministry because I thought it was exciting and dangerous and risk-taking, like the prophets in the Old Testament and in the New. I remember one time I was interning or helping out or being the youth director, whatever you want to call it, at a church in Shreveport. This was before seminary. And there was a guest minister that day, and he preached a sermon, and the sermon was titled, "Why I Am a Christian." And that got my imagination going. And I was excited, selfishly, that it really got my imagination going because I sort of have a bad habit of falling asleep if I sit still for too long. And so anything that can keep me excited is a good thing to keep me awake. I mean, I have fallen asleep in school, I've fallen asleep in church, at the DMV, at the dentist's office, and not waiting for my appointment, actually asleep in the chair while they were cleaning my teeth. So anything that can keep me interested and awake is a very good thing. In fact, the joke was in my family for a long time was that the reason I became a minister was so that I would quit falling asleep in church. And for the most part, it's worked. Anyway, so I was committed to staying awake, and I started thinking about what the answer to that question might be. And the only answer I came up with about why I am a Christian is because it is exciting, or because it is dangerous, that it is risky. Well, that's not the answer that guy came up with. And I can't really tell you what his answer was. I don't remember. I may have dozed off. I'm not really sure. But I was really surprised that the answer wasn't that it's because it's dangerous, because it's risky, because it's exciting. I mean, that's what the prophets' lives were like. They were dangerous, they were risky, they were exciting, and that's what pulled me towards ministry. I mean, in seminary, my senior chapel sermon was titled, "I Wish I Was Amos." And of course, as a result of that sermon, I got a letter in the mail a week later from a guy who was not a member of the seminary community, but who had been on campus and was in worship that day. And he informed me that he had also sent a letter to the dean of students and to my executive presbyter in Pines Presbytery, my home presbytery, informing them and me that he thought I should never be a minister, and he would do whatever he could in his power to keep me from being ordained. So, after a lot of, in general, freaking out, and a lot of assurances from the dean and from my executive presbytery, I got that first little taste about what it's like to be a prophet, or at least to even want to be a prophet. But even all these years later, I'm still drawn to them, to those risk takers. Micah was in the line of these risk takers. He fits squarely in with the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures that we've learned about so far. Think about over the past few months the prophets that we have experienced. We don't always consider Moses one of the prophets, but he was one of the prophets. He was in that prophetic tradition. I don't know if you remember much about Moses, but he grew up in Pharaoh's court, a Hebrew adopted into Pharaoh's court. And when God finally called Moses into ministry, Moses was kind of on the lam at that time. He had fled for his life after killing and murdering an Egyptian taskmaster. And so when God says to Moses, I want you to go and speak to Pharaoh and tell him to let go of my people, Moses at first wasn't too keen on the idea. I mean, God was telling him to go speak to Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world as far as Moses was concerned, and tell him, you got to let go of your workforce. And even though it doesn't say it in the text, I imagine there was a little bit of fear in Moses about what had happened in his past. A little bit of fear that maybe someone might remember that he had murdered that Egyptian taskmaster. And so God called him to go and speak and be in that dangerous place. Then a few weeks ago, we talked about Nathan. You all remember Nathan? The prophet who spoke to King David, right? So Nathan had to go and speak to King David. Now, anytime you go and speak to a king, I suppose, and you tell them that what they are doing is wrong, it's a little bit intimidating. But Nathan went to King David and not only told him that what he was doing was wrong, but told him that he had sinned against God. By telling the king that he had sinned against God, Nathan was risking incurring the wrath of the king. And the wrath of the king might be the cost of your life. That was the risk that he was taking. And then last week we talked about Elisha and Naaman. And Naaman, is this powerful commander of a foreign army. And he comes to Elisha, and Elisha doesn't give him the respect Naaman thinks he deserves. And Naaman has proven that he has no problem taking Hebrews as slaves, and yet still Elisha treats him with what Naaman I think of as disrespect. It's a dangerous place to be. The prophets are the risk takers, and Micah fits squarely into the tradition of these risk takers. These people who take risks on behalf of God. Now, when Micah was in ministry, we're still in a divided kingdom at this time. Micah is in the southern kingdom, unlike his predecessor Elisha. Elisha was in ministry about 100 years before Micah and was in the northern kingdom. Micah is in the southern kingdom of Judah. When that time, the northern kingdom of Israel has pretty much disappeared because it has been overtaken by the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire is starting to make inroads on the southern kingdom as well. Another one of Micah's contemporaries, besides King Hezekiah, who was the king at the time of the southern kingdom, was Isaiah. Probably recognize his name, right? So Isaiah and Micah in ministry about the same time, King Hezekiah in the southern kingdom. And King Hezekiah recognizes that the Assyrians are coming. And so he's got to come up with an idea about how to keep the Assyrian empire out of Judah. Or at the very least, how does he save Jerusalem, the capital of the empire, the center of government and religion? That's where Solomon's temple was. And so he devises an idea. And his idea is to fortify all of these small villages in Judah that are between Jerusalem and the advancing Assyrian army. To build them up so that when the Assyrian army passes by that way on their way to Jerusalem, they can try to stop them. Or at least maybe slow them down, or at least tax their resources so that either the army decides to turn back or they are weakened by the time they get to Jerusalem. It's a decent strategy, I guess, and it pretty much worked. Because even though the Assyrian army did lay siege to Jerusalem, they couldn't defeat Jerusalem. They ended up having to give up on that siege. So Jerusalem and the people of Jerusalem rejoiced. But that rejoicing came at a cost. One Old Testament scholar said that 37 villages in the kingdom of Judah were destroyed as the Assyrian army marched towards Jerusalem. Now, Micah's contemporary Isaiah, he was a big city prophet. Jerusalem. Micah, not so much. Micah was from a small village in Judah. And chances are his heart was with those people of those 37 small villages that had been destroyed. So Jerusalem was rejoicing because they had been saved, but those 37 villages were not rejoicing at all. And Micah's first words that we heard from David today was a proclamation against the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been saved, but Micah essentially says, not so fast. Don't get too excited. You will be destroyed. God is coming to destroy the high places. Now, the high places could mean one of two things. The high places in the ancient world were those places of worship. Sometimes they were referred to as places of worship for God, for Yahweh, the God of Israel. Other times they were places of worship for other gods, Canaanite gods, what we might call pagan gods. Well, that's the way that Micah is talking about those high places in this context. God is coming to destroy the high places. And what is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Micah is saying that the city of Jerusalem is a place where people no longer worship God, that they are worshiping other gods. Micah has essentially enraged at this point not only the people of Jerusalem, because he's told them their city is going to fall, the leadership of Jerusalem, because he has said the city will fall, the religious leaders of Jerusalem, because he has said you are not worshiping God. Micah is firmly in the camp of those who take risks on behalf of God. And then as we keep going through the passage, we get to that line that, if you're going to know any line or any verse from the book of Micah, it's going to be Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. This is Micah telling the people, God wants you. God doesn't want your sacrifices. God doesn't want your rivers of oil, your offerings of gold. God doesn't want your children. God wants you. And when Micah says this, he says this knowing full well that the priests have told the people, God wants your sacrifices. The priests told the people, God wants your sacrifices because their sacrifices supported the religious establishment that supported them, supported the king, and supported the kingdom. But Micah said, God doesn't want your stuff. God just wants you. Do you see how he could, at very least, be in tension with the religious establishment and the leaders of his day? Micah was in tension with those people when he told them, God doesn't want your wealth. God just wants you. Now, we can easily read this passage in today's term as an indictment. We can easily read this passage as an indictment upon our consumerist society, right? I mean, we live in a world where we believe that our stuff defines us. Our stuff says how important we are. Micah's saying that's not the case. So we can easily read it as an indictment of our consumerist society. We can easily read this as an indictment of people with wealth who use their wealth to get whatever or whomever they want. We can easily read that. We can easily read this as an indictment about the misappropriation of wealth, especially in our state, because this last week we have seen a political race that broke the records in spending. $93 million. Now, I don't know if $93 million can end homelessness in Texas, but it'd probably be a pretty good start. We can easily read this as an indictment of all kinds of other people. But the harder reading is a more personal one. The harder reading is that this is an indictment of the religious establishment and its leaders. Which means that this is an indictment on me. Micah's words are an indictment on me. and there were also priests. They existed together, and together they were able to lift up what God requires. Micah's words are a reminder to us of what God requires of us, and makes us ask the questions. What are you, what am I, what are we doing to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God? What is our church doing to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with our God? And it is a reminder for me, at the very least, that our church, to be the church, the true church, and not the fake establishment that Micah was indicting, our actions need to be those of justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with our God. It's easy to read this text and use it to point at other people and what they're doing wrong, how they're not serving God. But the harder reading, and maybe the more appropriate one, is for those of us who would like to be prophets to find out that they're priests. The harder reading is on us. Amen?